under the 9, we concluded that there weren't any health effects concerns with this test result. Quickly, just looking at these results graphically, I think it's easier to see. You can see the 9 sites down below. Those are the 1-hour sample results. They look, bottomed out close to 0 because most of them were not very high. And there's the 180 ppb TCQ short term. And here's what I'm talking about with the 24-hour data. There's the same 9 sites. There's the TCEQ long-term screening level. And as you can see, the one at Cannon Mercer was slightly above it. And then you can see how it's still well below the appropriate threshold comparison at 9 ppb. So based on these findings, we concluded that, within the study area and, based on the criteria used, that we didn't see anything that was being emitted at levels that would cause concentrations to be dangerous from a health effects standpoint. I would also add that if you look at the report online, the data was of a very high quality. The weather conditions were documented and were ideal and conformed with the study design. The production levels at the site were demonstrated to be typical of what the sites typically operate at. And all the quality assurance, quality control that came back from the laboratories was also within those benchmarks that are required to be met under those methods. And, that led us to have a high degree of confidence in the data that's reported. And incidentally, in the report and online, you can see the entire original data packages provided by the laboratories, which are third party to us and have their own licenses. So I'm going to give it to Dr. Kester, who's going to explain a little bit more about this.
I need a very tiny microphone here. It's a toy microphone here. No, which is forward? This one? Okay. All right. Well, so far we've got a bunch of chemical names, a bunch of numbers, and a bunch of acronyms. So I'm the toxicologist and risk assessor, and my job here, what I was asked to do, is try and make some sense of these data. How is it that we look at environmental data and interpret it? There's basically 3 things we can do, and they're right here. We can compare them, as Doug has done, to what are called risk-based screening levels. Those are, for example, the TCQ's AMCVs. EPA has their own set that are quite similar. ATSDR, as Doug mentioned, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, has their own set. Again, similar and similarly derived. We can also look at background concentrations. Many people don't realize that benzene, even though it's a known human carcinogen and it is a toxic chemical, it's also a very common chemical that we're actually surrounded by. Benzene is in this room, I promise you. It's certainly, and we'll talk a little bit about the concentrations that are all around us. So that's a way that we can also interpret environmental data. How do these data look compared to what we would measure anywhere else? And then finally, we can compare monitoring data to effects levels, because it's important to understand that the risk-based screening levels are no effects levels. Those are levels at which we expect nothing to happen to anybody, including sensitive members of the population. And so the dilemma arises when we're not under those screening levels. If we're under those screening levels, we go, bingo, we're good. If we're over them, does that mean we panic? Does that mean we expect adverse effects? No. So it's of interest to look at what are effects levels for a compound like benzene. Okay. So first, the concentration units that are often talked about in relation to VOCs, benzene and other VOCs, is parts per billion. You might also see measurements in units called micrograms per cubic meter. They're not directly comparable. You have to use a conversion factor to go from one to the other, but we're talking parts per billion. Just want to make sure you know what those are. They're a very tiny unit. It wasn't too long ago when we couldn't measure concentrations as small as a part per billion. Now we can go down to parts per quadrillion or quintillion, depending on what we want to do. But it's not so long ago that we thought getting down to a part per million was really doing pretty well. And note that a part per million is 1,000 parts per billion, okay? So that's the relationship between those two. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude, or lack thereof, of a part per billion, it's equivalent to these things that I've listed here: 1 second in 32 years, 1 inch in 15,000 some miles, etc. So it's a small concentration. That's not to say it's necessarily a trivial concentration, but it is a small concentration. So as I said, what I do is risk assessment. Toxicology, which I have my degree in and love deeply, is integral to this process. It's all too often given short shrift, I'm afraid, and more emphasis is placed on exposure. But in fact, both toxicity and exposure are critical if we're going to look at risk. Often we'll hear people say, oh, certain chemical causes these numbers of effect, without telling us, well, what level does that happen at? We have to know what the exposure is if we're going to know what the risk is, because toxicity alone doesn't give us risk. Okay? So in the process of risk assessment, we get toxicity information from both toxicological studies and epidemiological studies. In the case of benzene, we've got lots of data from both sources. And then for exposure, we're interested in the route of exposure. Is it inhalation? Is it ingestion? Is it dermal? Because that can make quite a profound difference depending on what the chemical is. The concentration and environmental media that we're coming into contact with. What our contact rate with that is. For example, how much soil do we eat in a day? Risk assessors have a number for that. How much do we inhale? How much do we weigh? All these factors. And also, very importantly, the duration and frequency, so the temporal aspect of exposure. It matters a lot how often you're exposed, for how long you're exposed, not just the concentration. So all of that has to be put together to estimate exposure, and together with toxicity, estimate risk. Okay? So, and that leads us to the central principle of toxicology and risk assessment, which is the dose makes the poison. That's the central tenet of toxicology, and I don't have time to bore you with where that comes from. It's really not boring, of course, but we'll just have to remember that the dose makes the poison. And these are just a couple of examples quickly. We often think of, when somebody asks you, name me a poison, you'll say arsenic, you'll say maybe methyl mercury, or maybe benzene. But in fact, anything can be a poison. Water can be a poison. Aspirin can be a poison, or it can cure your headache. Same thing with vitamin A, which we need for life, but can also kill us. Oxygen, which we obviously can't live with, can be very toxic. Okay, so just the dose makes the poison. Now the AMCVs, what are they? These are, as I said, risk-based screening levels. They're levels that are, and this is a quote from the TCQ guidance, and like I said, these values are not unique. They're just like everyone else's screening levels, and the definition for them is that they will not cause adverse effects in the general public, including sensitive subpopulations and people with pre-existing conditions, children, etc., because all those factors are taken into account, perhaps imperfectly. But because of lack of knowledge, the risk assessor makes consistently conservative assumptions about both exposure and toxicity, so that even though we don't know precisely what the exposure and risk are, we're pretty sure we make every effort to make sure that we're overestimating it rather than underestimating it. So, as a result, if the concentration is lower than the AMCV, you go, hallelujah, I'm done. However, if it's not, you don't go, oh my God, evacuate the neighborhood. You say, I'm going to take a closer look at this. And this is in fact what's going on in your communities. Okay. So, as Doug mentioned, the AMCVs are great if you have a 1 hour sample or if you have a year or multi-year sample. It's not so great if you have an in-between time, like 24 hours. Now that's a good sample length because it gives you an entire day, it integrates over an entire day. But you can't compare that to a short-term level because what's okay for 1 hour is not going to be okay for 24 hours. And similarly, what's okay for a lifetime is not applicable to what for just a 24-hour period. So the appropriate comparison here is to the acute MRL. ATSTR kind of jumped into the gap there. It's like a sister agency to the EPA, which is focused on chronic exposures and risks. And so it created this value, happens to be 9 parts per billion for benzene. And it has the same, I won't go through this, but it's the same series of definitions as the AMCBs have. Okay. Now, I said you can also look at effects levels, because it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, you know, all right, we've exceeded 1.4, or we've exceeded 9, or we've exceeded even 180. You tell me I don't have to panic, but what does it really mean? What is the risk associated with it? Well, we can get an idea of that by looking at levels that are known to be effects levels. Typically, regulatory agencies are focused on screening levels and long-term exposures, but EPA has developed a set of values called acute effects guideline levels, or EAGLES, another acronym for us. They've got 3 tiers of those. The first tier, the EAGLE ones, are values, and they have them for a whole bunch of chemicals, not just benzene, are values that are levels where you would expect the general population, again including sensitive individuals, to have a reaction that's reversible, that's not life-threatening, that's not very serious, and when you walk away and get out of the situation, you're going to be okay, you're going to recover. Okay, so, and that's for various lengths of time, from 10 minutes to 8 hours here. It's instructive for us to look at the 1-hour one, because we can compare that to the 180 short-term AMCB. And we say 52,000 is a level where I would see even a sensitive, perhaps, person in the population would be exposed to that level and have some irritation from benzene. When they walked away, they'd be fine. Okay? Then we can compare that to the 180, and that's a 289-fold difference. So that gives you an idea of kind of the cushion between the screening level and the effects level. If we compare the EAGLE 1 for 1 hour to the highest 1-hour sample that was collected in Doug's data set, that happened to be 3.15 parts per billion. That was collected at the same place where the value exceeded the long-term screening level, the Economercer Ranch. That's 16,500 times lower than a level at which you would see an effect. Okay. All right. So benzene, I mentioned it's everywhere. Where does it come from? The EPA has spent a long time investigating that question, and this figure is it's actually from the ATSTR toxicological profile for benzene, published in 2007, and that's a great resource online if you're interested in more toxicology information. That's a good resource. Anyway, this figure is from that, and it's based on data collected by the EPA saying, where does benzene come from? What is it being emitted from? And as we can see, in general, automobiles are the biggest source. Why? Because, of course, they're full of gasoline, which contains a couple of percent of benzene. It's lower than it used to be, but it's a couple of percent. Am I really over time?
Yeah.
Should I stop?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
She enjoys it.
Well, I'm sorry. Well, I guess I'll just very quickly do this one. This is from the same studies done by Lance Wallace at the EPA, looking at the sources of benzene exposure to individuals. So in the previous slide, we were looking at emissions. Now we're looking at how people get exposed. And what do we see is the biggest contributor? If you are a smoker, benzene is going to be given to you mostly from smoking. Okay? Automobiles are right up there. If you have an attached garage, you're going to have higher levels of benzene in your house. By the way, levels are always higher indoors than outdoors because of things like attached garages and smoking, and the fact that certain products, household products, still contain benzene, although much less than they used to. There's just one final thing. In writing about this, the ATSTR said, even passive exposure to cigarette smoke is responsible for more benzene exposure, about 5% of the total, than the emissions from the entire industrial capacity of the United States, about 3% of the total. So that gives us, I think, a better idea of what we're looking at with benzene. Okay? Sorry, that's it on this.
Thank you. all of you.